Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to this Bright Blue Fringe event, which we're doing in partnership with RWE and SSE Renewables. It is the penultimate Bright Blue event out of 27, so we're still going strong. But thank you for joining us on the sort of final day of Fringes at Party Conference, and it's good to see people in the audience for this. The title is Putting the Wind in Britain's Sails, Driving the Future of UK Wind Energy. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtags BrightBlue and CPC21. The Twitter handles are @WeAreBrightBlue, @RWE_UK, and @SSE. For those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. Our mission really is to defend and improve liberal society. We work across 7 research themes: bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering government, just institutions, and connected communities. We're very well known for our work on energy and environment policy and have had a lot of traction in recent years, particularly in the energy space. So we definitely called out for the early phase out of coal, which the government decided to bring forward to 2024. We think it could be earlier. And we projected that and pushed for that very early on at the end of the last decade. We've also done some recent work looking at how you decarbonise both the demand for and the supply of gas. I suppose the key questions tonight is looking at the consequences and the benefits of increased onshore and offshore wind in the UK. And really offshore wind in particular is seen as a kind of strong part of the UK's economic potential. And what reforms could the government introduce to provide greater support and certainty for investment in wind? How will the UK meet the 2030 wind energy target, which the Prime Minister announced in the speech last year as part of his 10-point plan for the green economy? And what will be the role of wind energy capacity in the development of the UK's hydrogen economy? And obviously the government has been talking up the benefits of a hydrogen economy as well. And then finally, of course, we can't do these panel events without talking about levelling up. So how can wind contribute to the levelling up agenda? What sort of opportunities can it provide for so-called left behind places and people? In terms of the panel, we've got an excellent panel. We have Ben Houchen, who is the Mayor of Tees Valley. To his left is Emma Pinchbeck, who is the CEO of Energy UK. Prior to that, the Deputy Chief Executive of Renewable UK. We have Andrew Jamieson to my near left, who is Chief Executive of the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult and is part of the Scottish Government's Energy Advisory Board. We have Pavel Miller on my far left, who is the Head of Corporate Affairs at SSE Renewables. And to my far right is Tom Glover, who is the RWE's UK Country Chair. I didn't introduce myself. You can see that I'm not Sarah Sands. Unfortunately, she is with a family emergency, so I've stepped in to chair, so you're left with me. So let's start with 5-minute introductions, and then we will open it up to the floor, and we will also be receiving questions through the live stream. And just to remind people who are watching through the live stream, you can ask questions through the Slido link, which is just below the screen that you're watching. And we will capture those questions and then I will ask them and I will be receiving them on my phone. So let us start with Ben.
Thank you, Ryan, and you're a fantastic substitute for Sarah, but I'm sure she'll be missed. But I'm going to start with the third question, because I'll let the more learned people on the panel address some of the more detail than I, but I'm going to talk about levelling up and what offshore wind can mean to areas, in particular red wall areas like Teeside, if you want to get into the politics of it, but in effect a lot of port-based post-industrial areas that have had manufacturing centres for a long, long time, that have a pride and a sense of purpose and want to do this again. So if I give you the Teeside context, we had a closure of a steelworks in 2015 that led to the closure of the Redcar Steelworks that cost 3,500 jobs. It was probably the lowest ebb of Teeside's history, with the final end to steelmaking on Teeside, and it absolutely devastated communities across Middlesbrough and Redcar in particular, but the reverberations of the closure of the steelworks were felt further afield. And what we've managed to do through devolution, through more local control and some more strategic planning about what we want the future of Teeside to become, we've been able to reinvent ourselves. And there's, I think, quite a poetic circular economy going on in Teeside, that the heavy carbon emitting industries in chemicals processing, and in particular in steel, those same skill sets, those same experiences and those same people that built things like the Shard and the Sydney Harbour Bridge and some of the steel beams that went into the cabinet war rooms that are next to the Treasury, can be used again in a very green, environmentally friendly way through lots of different industries. I've heard that hydrogen be talked about. CCUS as well is a key driver for Teeside. But the one that has really captured everybody's imagination for lots of different reasons is offshore wind. And we're very proud to be the home of one of the most recent investments in the offshore wind industry, which will be LM Wind / GE building their new offshore wind blade factory in the heart of the former Redcar Steelworks site, which is now the UK's largest free port, which also played a huge role in being able to land them into the region. Now, what does that mean for levelling up? Well, it means that the 3,500 people that lost their jobs, including those, that was direct and indirect, by the way. There were 1,800 people directly employed by the steelworks. 2,250 jobs are projected by LM Wind to be created when that factory becomes operational in April of 2023. We have a skill set in the Tees Valley of 29% of people have a level 3 qualification or above. The LM Wind factory will require 74% of employees to have a level 3 qualification or above. So there are challenges that come with the offshore wind sector, but it's a fantastic challenge to face because it reinvents an area like Teeside as one of the hubs of the green industrial revolution. It is powered absolutely by the government's target for 40 gigawatts of wind in the near future, and a place like Teeside is going to deliver it. But what it actually means is it provides a sense of purpose. It provides money in people's pockets, significantly above what is the average wage in Teeside of £24,000, and it helps to create that manufacturing centre again. And having somebody like GE on the site will lead, and already is leading, to the fact that the Doggerbank wind farm that will be built just 80 miles, nautical miles off the Redcar coastline where the steelworks is, the main cable is already being built by SSE and RWE to be able to land it on Teeside. And there's some really fantastic conversations that are coming off what is a fantastic UK success story in offshore wind around the production of green hydrogen, with conversations going on with SSE and Equinor and BP. That means that we can once again take our place on the world stage as being a world lead in manufacturing. And I genuinely believe that if we can get this right, that Teeside could become synonymous with renewables and with net zero in the same way that Silicon Valley is for IT and social media. It is no longer hyperbole to say that with some of the investments that we've landed. And just to finish on, this is going to require more work. And as I was saying to a couple of the panellists beforehand, if this investment and a couple of the ones that are potentially coming to the likes of the Humber and the east coast of Scotland, if that's all we're able to achieve, then we'll have missed out on a huge opportunity here to be able to capture what is not just a UK success story, actually, if I can be so bold. It's actually a northeastern coast, however you define that, actually from the Humber up to the east coast of Scotland, where all of that expertise has been created and can really drive the UK economy again. So I'm really excited what comes next. The LM Wind factory is being future-proofed for how big these blades can go, and we were actually asking Andrew on the panel, actually, how big can these blades bloody go? I mean, you would think at some point physics breaks down and these things will snap very, very quickly. But we're very, very excited by this journey, and it really means that actually to deliver something like this, what we've seen in offshore wind is actually a very productive relationship between the private sector, between local government through devolution, which has been very successful in this element, but also the backing of government. And all three have really got behind this. And I think we've played our part locally, but I think you can't underestimate the tweaking of the sector deal and the pressure, actually, that we know that the Prime Minister and Kwasi have been putting on some of the manufacturers to be able to make sure that we capture as much of the supply chain and the manufacturing to reach that 60% target. So it's been a great success for everybody. Let's not pat ourselves on the back too much. Let's just say that this is the beginning of the journey, but it's the beginning of a really exciting new future for the UK, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion on the panel.
Great, thank you, Ben. I'm just going to go to a kind of political question for me, which is opposition to wind. Because, I mean, I think we're all going to be quite enthusiastic about it. And I'm just trying to think why people, I'm thinking both onshore and offshore wind. Where is the opposition to that coming from, and what's driving that? And do you think it's a sort of something that we should be really worried about, or do you think that it's something actually amongst conservative circles generally, the kind of skepticism with wind is dying? Or
so I'm really interested. I'm genuinely interested to hear what Emma's got to say about this, because offshore wind will play a role, and obviously getting to 40 gigawatts is extremely important. But if you were to speak to the average skeptic on the street, let's not take an expert or somebody who is politically interested. The default will be to energy security and the intermittent nature of offshore wind, and the idea, the average person in the street, well, it wasn't blowing wind today, and therefore where are we getting our energy from? And that's why you've always got to have coal-fired power stations backed up. So part of the conversation with offshore wind is also explaining in very simple but very comprehensive terms that it is just part of the wider jigsaw. And it has to be paired with other renewable baseload energy sources. I appreciate we're talking about offshore wind. We probably don't want to get too far down the line of a discussion on nuclear reactors or SMRs or AMRs. But we've got to tackle that skepticism, which is as basic as it is, really. It's just sometimes the wind doesn't blow, and therefore where do we get our energy from? If every kettle in the country, as the Prime Minister has said, is going to be powered by wind, we've got to be able to demonstrate what is that energy map. And yes, offshore wind is essential to that, but it's more than that, and I don't think we've done enough to explain how it fits in with the wider landscape.
Great. Emma, over to you.
Thank you for throwing me that question, Ben.
You answered much more importantly.
So a little bit for those of you that... so you should know that for this event, my team gave me notes because I like wind turbines enough that I'm likely to go off-piste. In fact, for my hen do, they dressed me as one. So let's just assume we're starting from there with my views on wind energy. But it's
it could have been ironic.
But I come from Stroud, which as a Conservative House seat, it's also a swing seat, and I talk about that often because my strong political instinct about why I work on decarbonisation and climate change is small c Conservative. I fundamentally don't want that landscape to change very much, but Stroud is also a pretty radical seat and one that doesn't mind a lot of change. So I grew up with a instinct that said I want to protect this landscape, but also an instinct that said, and that includes putting a wind turbine on top of it. And those two things have never been incompatible for me. And I think sometimes we have kind of fallen into the trap of thinking that that kind of conservative values don't match up to big infrastructure change. And I think people's understanding of that piece of it is also shifting. So that's the first thing I'd say. More specifically on the politics, there was always widespread public support for renewables, always. I don't think the percentage has ever fallen below sort of 75% in the entire time I've been working. What we get, though, is that breaks down at local level, and it's often about infrastructure change, and that's just scary. And I think we made it about wind, when actually it doesn't matter whether you're building a road or new houses or wind turbines. Change is frightening in a local community. So as an industry, we've got much, much better. And I'm really proud of the level of community engagement we do. We've got an excellent planning system, which I think has given people reassurance. And I think we're also trying to increasingly put benefits into local places with that infrastructure, and I think that helps. Lastly, on the politics, the reason we're going to be doing more onshore wind and solar now is very simple. This is no longer a story about climate change action and about investing in green technologies because it's the right thing to do. Over the only 10 years that I've been working, renewables have been gone from an environmental technology that we're pushing through the system to just the heart of the future energy system. And the economics is now very clear if you're in the energy sector. There is absolutely no doubt that renewables are going to be the incumbent technology, and therefore we're having to rework the rest of the energy system around that assumption. And our values and markets and products and services and the other technologies on the end of the system around this sheer economic force of renewables. And so we're going to do onshore wind and solar because they're cheap. They provide jobs for people, they provide industrial benefits, but they also provide cheap and affordable and secure supply. And that realisation has changed the narrative, because we're not doing these things just because. It's not a kind of climate push through the system. It's a yes, that and the environmentalism, but also this is just a sensible economic choice now. And I think that's why we're doing onshore wind and solar, because you'd be mad to exclude the cheapest form of energy generation. And I think most of the public get behind that in the same way, because they understand it in the way they used to understand the gas-fired power station. Gas-fired power stations aren't particularly pretty, sorry Tom, but you know, but that's not the point. They're a very valuable, cheap source of power that we need to run the economy, and that's a different equation. So I think, yeah, the politics has moved, and I think it will continue to move as we see all the benefits that come off these technologies.
Great, thank you, Anna.
But don't trust me, I want dressed as a wind turbine.
Hopefully Tom doesn't dress as a gas-fired power station.
Though could he.
Okay, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks. Well, colleagues have spoken very well as to what the issues are and opportunities are at heart. Huge economic growth in front of us from the growth of changing our energy infrastructure. And I agree with them. I've been around a lot longer than Emma has in this industry. And I've seen firsthand communities faced with change, and that just means uncertainty. And I think we did miss a trick early on in renewables overall in terms of employment. So sometimes there was a bit of an imposition about a big change to energy infrastructure, but people were not seeing the opportunities. That's changed now. I think offshore wind in particular, and I think onshore wind coming back, as well as other renewable sources, are much more meaningful now to the general public, to our ecosystems, including education and training and universities, to actually get into the real heart and the nub of jobs. So I'm at the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. There are 9 catapults set up by government, part funded by government, but I've also got to bring in industry revenue. But we're there to drive innovation into the sectors that we serve. And that means we go into territories, in terms of technology, where there's generally a market failure. So, for example, we are helping GE and LM bring the world's largest turbine to the market. It's a 12 megawatt turbine. This is, I need to write this down, 260 metres tall. These are very, very big machines. We've got some of the largest assets in the world to help that company get to the market and to bring, frankly, the lowest cost electricity that I think we're seeing at all in the renewable sphere. It's a fantastic result for the UK. When I led a report for government some 10 years ago, prices were at £150 a megawatt hour. You don't need to know what a megawatt hour is. Now they're in the 30s. It's a staggering cost reduction job that we've done to make the industry truly competitive with all other industry offerings. The task in front of us now, around net zero, is on the levelling up, is getting into the jobs side of things. And I want to reassure you all, I think it's a very, very doable thing, because we've got to think about offshore wind farms, or wind farms in general, not so much as turbines, but a collection of mechanical parts. You separate them into individual bits. There's lots of opportunities for UK PLC to get deeper into supply chain activities than we've been able to do in the past. Some things are locked out, some things are the IP of the manufacturers of turbines, but generally they're very, very good procurement agents. So if you can make motors and gearboxes and electronic control systems and cables and all these things, you have every chance of getting into the procurement systems of the world's biggest manufacturers. And as Ben has talked about, we're attracting those manufacturers to our shores. We didn't have that before. This is all new. Now the next thing that's coming around, if we think about net zero targets, so we're going from, again, you don't need to think about the numbers, but you think about the scale. We have 10 gigawatts installed of offshore wind today. The net zero target is 100 gigawatts. 10 times what we've installed today by 2050. That's going to mean staggering growth. And that growth will require a lot more supply chain. It'll need solutions to grid, because we don't have a system truly designed and fit for purpose, so we'll need to think about that. And we need to think about the planning system so that we can keep the pipeline going of new projects, so as we can inspire our supply chain colleagues to create the scale and investments that are required to answer the call. And one of the things I'm also really excited about are the opportunities that offshore wind can bring to other sectors. So we've got an oil and gas community under huge pressure to decarbonise. There are lots of jobs in oil and gas I don't want to see go out the window. Surely our sector can offer opportunities for oil and gas growth. We talked about hydrogen earlier on, those kinds of things. Ditto the defence sector. Ditto ship manufacturing and any kind of large-scale fabrication. And let me just I'll close off with one big opportunity that's coming. That 100 gigawatts says we are going to have to put an awful lot more turbines in the water by 2050. We don't have the coastline, near-shore coastline capacity to cope with that. We have to go further from shore. Further from shore means really deep water, and that implies what we call floating wind solutions. So you've got to imagine a turbine whose swept area is bigger than the London Eye, on a very tall tower, sitting on a platform that floats on the sea surface, right, and doesn't fall over, right? There are prototypes showing that's doable. Kincardine in the northeast of Scotland is just commissioned. It's doable. But the UK's opportunity sits in how do we fabricate these substructures? That's what the oil and gas guys did in the late 60s, early 70s. They found the way forward for all of that. So our economic opportunity is from Aberdeen to Cornwall to Wales to the northeast, etc. I am really excited about what the sector's got to offer. And very finally, Chairman, it needs a lot of collaboration and close coordination between all participants, including government. So let's not just assume, chuck this to the market and it'll all come. I've been around long enough to go, we've got to get into a room together and do more forward planning around that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Pavel, over to you.
Great, thanks. Well, so maybe I should start off with saying I love big turbines, I cannot lie, but I won't continue my talk through the medium of 1980s rap tunes. So great to be here. I'll probably go one further than what Emma said earlier about renewables providing, the backbone of the system. Actually, it will be wind energy which provides the backbone of the future energy system, and there are simple reasons why. It's cheap, scalable, and deliverable. And I'm not in the game of trying to talk down other technologies, but I don't think other technologies are stepping up in the way that we've seen wind energy do over the past 10 years and before that and going forwards. So, SSE Renewables, we're really proud that we're part of that. Actually, no one's building more offshore wind in the world right now, more than SSE, and all of that is actually in the UK. Dogger Bank, huge project that Ben referred to earlier, 3.6 gigawatts, that's going to be the world's largest offshore wind farm. I'm also building Seagreen, which will be the largest in Scotland. And there's more to come. We've got Berwick Bank, which will be even bigger than Dogger Bank in Scotland towards the end of the decade. So it goes further and further. And just put it in context, I know we talk about pounds a megawatt hour and everyone gets a bit lost, but you touched on it, Andrew. But the most recent ones we had, including Dogger Bank, did come in at a price which was just below £40 a megawatt hour. If you contrast with what we're seeing energy prices now, electricity wholesale prices, so consequently gas, anywhere between £100, £200 a megawatt hour. Now, we're not going to have that all the time, but it puts into context that, that wind is cheap and it can secure us lower cost energy costs in the longer term. SSE recently published a report called Net Zero Without Breaking the Bank, which we got LCP to commission, which showed a lowest cost pathway to reaching a net zero electricity system, and showed that by going further, particularly on offshore wind, can help us achieve net zero quicker and cheaper. But as touched on earlier, wind's not going to be the only answer. We are going to need a mix on the system, and there are a whole load of different technologies. We're going to need particularly flexible technologies to accompany that wind. I think one particular area is long duration storage is one that we're going to need more of, because actually what we don't want to have is situations where we're wasting valuable wind, and actually if we can store that and use it for the times when there's less wind generating, even better. So what do we need? So, the industry doesn't need subsidy. We've got to the point where we're low cost. But I think in terms of positioning wind as the solution in the longer term, we are going to need, as with many things in terms of delivering net zero, a sort of vaccine rollout mentality if we're really going to scale up this industry in the next 10 years and beyond. Already we're talking about quadrupling the amount of offshore wind from what we've got today, 10 gigawatts, to achieve the Prime Minister's target of 40 by 2030. So what do we need? We need a lot of work on things which frankly probably are quite boring to a lot of you, but really, really important, around planning, a grid, preemptively invest in the grid so we can connect these projects to the grid and ultimately to supply businesses and homes. We're going to need to make difficult decisions about how we use the sea space. It's a crowded space, as Andrew talked about. Yes, floating deeper waters will provide part of the solution, but still we need government with relevant bodies to make strategic decisions at where we're going to deploy these projects. And also to touch on in terms of, onshore wind has got to be a part of the answer as well, because it is lower cost and can be delivered. But the important thing is that we do this obviously in in collaboration with communities, and that's what we've got a great track record of doing. You know, at SSE last year, we were really proud to have supported the communities where we had onshore wind farms to the tune of about £10 million, and that led to deploying some funds, particularly during COVID, which was really, really positive. So more of that. The last point I'd like to touch on really is just on the sort of clean industrial revolution, and you know, it's been touched on already. But I think it's fair to say that probably in terms of the wind sector, we haven't seen as many of the benefits come economically to the UK as we might have liked. But we're now fortunately seeing a step change in that. And that's really as a result of a lot of the collaboration that we need between central government, local government, you know, developers, manufacturers, the whole supply chain, and the sector deal had a big part in doing that. And just, you know, give a shout out. I'm not just saying this because he's on the panel in terms of what Ben's done in Teeside, but we've really got to use that as a model actually for other parts of the supply chain, whether we're looking at you know, cables, foundations, other parts. So not just from a blades perspective, because as Ben said, it would be, you know, it'd be a failure if all we could deliver is just another blade factory. So we really should use that as a model. But what will be important as well is not just building these manufacturing facilities, but ensuring we have a workforce that can actually work in them. And I know the concept of just transition is something which is thrown out quite a lot, and probably people think, you know, what does this really mean? SSE was the first company, I believe, last year that published the Just Transition Strategy based around 20 principles, quite detailed. You can go and find the report on the website. We're not purporting to know all the answers to all of those challenges, but we thought it was important to put a view out about what needs to be done by companies like us, as well as government and others. And there are probably, you know, in terms of the skilled workforce aspect, there are probably two parts to that. So one is around transitioning workers from fossil industries into working into the renewable sector. We actually recently just conducted some research within our company, and we were actually quite pleasantly surprised about the number of people who have come across without even us necessarily knowing. And they talked about actually the pride in place and being part of you know, a sector that's got a future in terms of renewables, but also actually some other aspects of moving from say the oil and gas industry, where actually it's maybe better for their home life. They can be home more rather than 2 weeks offshore and 2 weeks on. So there are great aspects of that. But in terms of the new generation as well, it needs a lot of focus. And I think that needs a lot of work, not just by the sector itself, but again, in collaboration with central and local government. And, you know, really that early age, I mean, for again, on Dogger Bank, the community fund we got in place, which at the moment is focused on East Riding and then we'll go up to Teeside, is really focused on STEM. So getting in very early, talking about the opportunities to work in this sector, you know, to broadly say we need it to be a diverse, young, driven workforce, and you know, I've got a lot of confidence in that. So, yeah, onwards and upwards. Feel enthusiastic. Over to Tom.
Great, thank you, Pavel. Tom.
Oh my God! So having been gas shamed, and I didn't dress as a wind turbine on my stag do. I'm feeling a little bit.
I mean, I was dressed. I want to be clear about that.
Okay.
There was no voluntary. You know,
I mean, it's very difficult after such an audience to really add much, but I'm going to add a little bit onto everybody's themes because I think there is just to emphasise some stuff. I mean, I think first of all, let's talk about the scale of the opportunity. I think that's a really good place to start. So what are you talking about? So just to be clear, RW at the moment is investing £5 billion in the UK on 2 offshore projects today. We've just finished our onshore cable for Triton Knoll, and we're going to be doing it for Sophia, and that goes straight into the Lackenby substation, which is in the Tees. And so that's the kind of stuff you're having just for 2 wind farms, 5 billion. Yeah, and RWE is investing 9 billion in the next 3 years globally, and we have the UK's largest offshore pipeline. So you're looking at billions and billions and billions, over 10 billion pounds of investment just that RWE could invest into the UK. And I think then we talk about local content, and the sector has committed to 60% local content at least by 2030. So these are local UK jobs. I have to be a bit unfair to Ben and kind of expand it a little bit outside the Tees Valley and basically say what is actually quite surprising is where these projects are coming is almost 100% correlated to places that do need to level up. So whether it's Teeside, whether it's Humberside, whether it's North Wales, whether it's South Wales, actually it's a really good correlation. And it's a really good correlation to the old industries. So, you know, Emma gas shamed me, but actually as somebody who actually started buying coal, right, and gas, actually I've got a big affiliation with these older businesses. And what makes me really proud is actually actually having worked with that company and coming with people who've been in the fossil side and actually growing into renewable business and seeing that change in the communities, I think that actually, from our RWE perspective, is quite respectful of the just transition. And then I think it's always good to talk about real examples, so real things that are happening, because you can talk about these big numbers of billions and percentages, but talk about what's actually happening on the ground. So, you know, what we see is we've invested in over 10 ports around the UK where we've got O&M, and these are all in areas like Grimsby, like Teeside, like Port of Mostyn in Wales, like all these like lower areas. There's money, real money going in. And what, again, makes me proud, I used to go on holiday in the North Wales, and you can really see those areas prospering from the amount of offshore wind that we're putting there. And we've just opened, for example, our new O&M hub in Grimsby, and it's got 60 jobs. It's going to be our regional specialist for major component repair in Grimsby. 80% of the people employed are from the local area, locally trained apprentices. So it is local jobs that we're doing, and these people, you know, were working on things like the refineries, you know, along the Grimsby area that are shutting down. So that's real local stuff. I think just picking up on the question that you asked at the beginning, Tom, around, well, what does it feel like to actually try and do these projects? So we've got 7 development projects at the moment ongoing in various places around the UK. And I would say we see some interesting stuff. So Owley Moor, which is our Gwynty Moor extension in the northwest, we're just finishing our kind of little roadshow in our van that goes along the coast and visits all the people and make sure we have real community engagement. And it's met more than 800 people. More than 80% are positive. 80% are positive, right? So we're getting to that area. Now, I can tell you we did Gwynty Moor, 10, 15 years ago, and we weren't getting that. We were getting a lot of restrictions. So actually, at the local level, we're getting more and more positivity. However, we still have some issues at the local level. We do have inconsistencies sometimes between what politicians might say on a national stage and what they'll say at their local stage, in terms of kind of at the national stage being, you know, champions of net zero or whatever, and the local stage, you know, complaining about what's going on at the local level. And I think we need this honest conversation that to get to net zero, it's not necessarily easy, and there is going to have to be maybe some cost, maybe some local inconvenience. And what it is, we need that honest conversation that the alternative, which is climate change, is even worse. And we need to kind of say, well, you know, what we need to do as an industry is make it as less disruptive as possible. So I just talked about that cable that we've just done in Tside to Knoll. We've already restored almost all the hedgerows and all the farm, and it's back to agriculture. So the only thing we're leaving at the end is one very modern substation. Right, the rest of it, 57 kilometres of land we've basically dug up and restored. And, you know, we're actually happy. And I was down at Rampion last week, sorry for the Labour Party conference, I apologise, we're party neutral. I was speaking to some local people who said the level at which we're restoring and maintaining that land is materially better. So we spend $2.5 million a year just cutting hedgerows and maintaining the land where that onshore cable went. Right, so before that was just local farmers just doing their thing. We're actually maintaining hedgerows and making sure that it's okay. Maybe just a bit on the security of supply point, which was another question that came up. So we are the UK's second largest generator, and we supply 10 million homes, and we want to make sure there's power all the time, whether the wind blows or the wind doesn't blow. And yet almost 90% of our investments are going into wind. So we believe we can do it, and we believe that 8,000 hours at least a year can be low carbon, zero carbon, very straightforwardly, to be honest. There is a difficult 800 hours, right? There is, you've got to be honest about it. But we as an industry are working through solutions, whether that be putting hydrogen into our gas-fired power stations, whether that be carbon capture uses and storage. So we will come up with a solution, whether it's long duration, like Pavel talked about, we will come up with a solution with the right long-term vision and policy. The engineering solutions are there. It's just a matter of making it happen. And it is going to be a challenge. But I'm absolutely convinced we can do it. Then I think all the 3 things that Pavel said, say what else do we need at the very technical level? We need planning, we need preemptive grid, we need marine spatial planning, and I would just summarise what I said before. The most important thing we need from politicians is an honest conversation. And it's actually setting the scene of, actually, renewables can do it, but there is going to be some areas where it's difficult. There is going to be some cost, and we need to make sure how that's fairly justified, fairly spread across people like vulnerable customers and make sure that, you know, that we have the impact in the right area. Yeah, we need to make sure. But that honest conversation always needs to start with, even any increase in cost is better than the alternative. The alternative, as we're seeing now through climate events around the world, is just not acceptable. So we have no choice but to do it. Thanks.
Great, thank you, and thank you very much, all of you, for your contributions. Interesting what you were saying there at the end, Tom, or near the end, about infrastructure development. We've done a report recently called Nature Positive, just looking at public attitudes towards new types of development, whether it's residential or infrastructure, and there's a real kind of public support for the government's biodiversity net gain principle. So development's very much in support of them if there's an improvement in the natural environment, and developers are obliged to do that. Even, for example, when we tested people's attitudes towards building on the greenbelt, there was a majority public support across all ages, different political backgrounds, for that development if the developers were obliged to really have the biodiversity net gain, and that's properly enforced. So I found that quite interesting. Right, let's open it up to questions and thoughts. Please wait for the microphone to come to you. And just to remind people again who are watching on the live stream that you can ask it through Slido, and please tell us your name and where you're from. So, any questions or thoughts? Please don't be shy. Right, okay, here we go, this chap here.
It's definitely last fringe events.
Thank you for that. Found that really fascinating, and I was just wondering, since it seems almost straightforward even, that now it's not only wind energy, not only would let us meet our climate change needs, but it's it's economically possibly the best way one's best way of producing our energy at home. The sort of vaccine rollout level of determination that we would need to really roll out and level up our wind energy production, I was wondering, what would that really entail, like in terms of government intervention or maybe regulatory change, or is there a sort of skills gap that needs to be addressed in from the UK working population? I was wondering, what would that look like, the sort of plan to get us there?
Great, thank you. Good question. Andrew.
Super question. I mentioned at the very end of my remarks, let's not just leave it to the markets, because markets will go so far and then hit just natural barriers. We have benefited massively since the privatisation of our electricity sector in the early 1990s. I was there, that's how old I am. We've seen prices tumble. What we've got is a very, very, very competitive sector. Very competitive. As we look to net zero and the huge opportunities in front of us, we've got to think about, let's keep the competition. I'm not advocating we don't, but we've got to think about the gaps in the economic opportunity, and we've got to think about how we can pull, POOL, the weight of all the investments that are going on. When you've got such a fiercely competitive market, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. So the sector deal has attempted, so this is the offshore wind sector deal, but there are others. It has started to create the thinking towards a more collaborative framework between the industry at large and government to see how we can tackle the problems and interventions that you talked about. There is a skills shortage, and the industry needs help in seeing how it can unify more readily to talk about what the skills shortage is and to talk about how it can help answer the calling. The ultimate, I mentioned again in my remarks, we need a lot more supply chain growth. We've got fantastic ambition and targets, 100 gigawatts of offshore wind. If I'm a factory owner, I don't know how big my factory should be. How many orders am I going to get in the next 5-10 years? Allow me to create a bankable investment case to take to my banks as I can grow to that. And these are some of the things where we've got to get smarter on building the investor confidence in the supply chain to allow them to grow at the pace at which the pull through from the developers is actually going to look to. And sitting in the middle of all of that is the skills gap. The skills will sit, I think, more naturally with the manufacturers. There's some of it in obviously running the wind farms, etc., right? But a lot of it is supply chain growth. We need to see the best ways forward we can possibly muster to give investor confidence to the supply chain to rise to our ambitious targets that we've got.
Emma.
All right, so a quick apology to Tom for gas shaming him. I should note he's on my board, which is why I feel free to make fun of my board members in public. That's a very good thing to do to your boss, I always find, in a public setting. But I did nearly also try and name my daughter Sophia before my husband realised that was a wind farm name. So, look, if you're talking about what does the kind of moonshot look like, in fact, it's not even the moonshot, it's just to deliver the things that governments say that they want. It looks like this, in order. So in the market as it's currently designed, we probably need to do what we already do well and do more of it at scale. So the CFD fourth allocation round, which is the kind of auction system, is big in terms of volume and looks really good, but we need to probably hold auctions more regularly, we think. So we need kind of more of that sort of scale, that kind of ambition more often. There's lots of different views on the CFD in the sector, but just to roughly characterise it, we've moved from that being a mechanism that's about subsidising renewables and instead being something that sort of guarantees a market for both the supply chain and investors. So it's really, the more regular it is, the easier it is to scale up. It's kind of that simple. So there's that bit, do more, do it faster, get the markets right. On the market front, and this is the kind of system point that we've all spoken to, we do also need those other technologies to come forward, because weirdly other technologies may well constrain how much wind we can bring on. So we need interconnection, we need CCUS, we need hydrogen to come forward, we need decisions on new nuclear, because we need to know what we're putting around the renewables in the system. So the quicker we get markets for that too, and market design for that too, great. When I left my previous organisation and we were thinking about renewables, I went out the door saying, I think non-market barriers are as big as market barriers now. And for us in the industry, that's planning and consenting and licensing and grid and meeting things like environmental standards and so on. These all add time to projects, but what you should know is that we licensed our offshore wind sites about once every 10 years. Clearly, we're going to need to speed that process up. Similarly, for kind of consenting and planning processes, they take a long time and we need to speed those up. So we need government to look at the planning system. We can't do that as industry. And then on network connection, this is a controversial one where you sit in the industry, both in terms of how you finance it, because it's regulated. So that anticipatory investment bit is regulated. But also how we plan for it and who does that planning are really big questions that we think government has to grasp hold of. And the offshore connection bit is done through a separate mechanism, but it applies equally that we're just going to need much more coordinated grid and the whole system and for our offshore connections. So we'd be really encouraging government to look at that. And that brings me to the last thing, which if government is really serious, if they're really serious, then we need to look at our institutions in government and the weight we put on net zero and this kind of delivery. And we've been calling for a long time for the Treasury to have a sort of net zero test on fiscal policy. And the simple reason for that is this is a whole economy transition. This is not a niche thing that's happening over in the energy system. Energy revolutions previously have driven whole economy change. They've changed the values about how we live. They've changed our social structures. They've changed jobs, everything on the other end of this. Government needs to grasp the idea that that's what we're talking about here. And it needs to be not just a BEIS responsibility, but something that is a kind of cross-Whitehall responsibility. So we'd love to see institutional change that reflects that. And for those of you that are really energy geeky, you can find me later and we can talk about things like the system architect or the future system operator and the stuff we need to do in the energy sector to plan this. But fundamentally, there's a job for government on really getting hold of the scale of the challenge. There you go.
I don't know if you had any thoughts.
I just want to explore just one of the points, because I think Emma's explained it extremely well, is the regularity of the CFD auction, which is a big fight that we went into bat on with the offshore wind industry into government to try and get that regular cycle. I know it's something that Kwasi, when he was energy minister, was keen on, and being able to have it. I mean,
the
biannual auctions now is a big win. Interestingly enough, again, just as a very practical example, part of reshoring the supply chain and making sure we have UK-based manufacturers comes fundamentally just down to commercials. And it's great having biannual auctions, but it, as Emma suggested, it doesn't create the regularity that means, for example, a SEA or a GE or, all of these offshore wind manufacturers that are aware that they need to come to the UK, but aren't able to quite make a commitment or are in the process of trying to make a commitment because they don't have sight far enough in advance of the contracts that they're winning. So one of the big things that we've had to manage, which I think is fair to say with LM Wind and GE, is they don't actually have sight beyond, in effect, 10 years realistically of where they're going for offshore wind. And so we've had to manage that as part of physically being able to develop what is a 850,000 square foot facility, because they're saying, well, we can't stay here for 30, 50 years because we don't know if we're going to have any work after 10 years. So we've been able to, through devolved government, working with government, we've been able to bridge that. So we're able to build the facility, get someone like a legal general in to help us fund it. But if we could get something much more regularly and actually further out, so people could get a much greater pipeline, not just over the next couple of years by making it annual, but actually trying to get the government to license, in effect, these CFD, or so I'm using the wrong language, but basically get these CFDs out into 15, 20, 25 years' time, so these companies could build a pipeline knowing where their business is coming in 20, 30 years' time. It's much easier for a business to go back to their main board and say, there's 30 years of work in the UK, but for us to deliver it, we realistically have to be in the UK. And actually, by being in the UK, if they can make it work, it can work, because if you can bring these clusters together, then shortening the logistics chains for the assembly ports actually saves them a huge amount of money as well. So if you can get that kind of 30, 25 plus year timeline, if you're thinking from a real estate development point of view, that allows you to take, in effect, the value of what they're doing, get it funded, get it built. But at the minute, that's one of the reasons I think a lot of other areas outside of Teeside are finding it quite difficult to bring the UK manufacturing onshore, because they don't have devolution that in effect helps us underwrite the factory, that allows you to say, right, we're coming to Teeside, because in effect, you know, they're able, if it all goes horribly wrong, which I guarantee it won't, could in effect walk away in 10 years' time. You can't build a development case for real estate of that nature on a 10-year business plan. And it's really, I mean, we can get into each one of those strands, but for me, when I'm trying to fill what is the largest free port in the UK, the largest brownfield site in Western Europe, the real commercials of property development to some extent can come into conflict with where we currently are to be able to go further.
Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in next. I think you raised some really good points there, Ben, as do others, which is, yes, how do you provide that certainty? And actually, the LM factory Teeside is a great example. So obviously the fantastic part you played in central government, and obviously GEC, you know, the long-term opportunity in the UK market. But actually what was unique about that, and the role that SSE Renewables played with its JV partners on Dogger Bank, was the project was unique in terms of its scale. 3.6 gigawatts for a project is huge in 3 phases. And that made it very attractive for LM to come, to say, actually, we can produce blades for you from this factory that can supply this wind farm. You know, but the nature of the competitive process via the auctions, I mean, that's not often the case, and it can be very hard, say, if developers got just one project of, say, 1 gigawatt, to then talk to a manufacturer, come and locate here, because they'll say, oh, well, it's great if we can work with you in your one, but what about projects after that? And then there's no guarantee. So, you know, there are no easy solutions for that. You know, it's not to say that competition has been successful, but I think, you know, going back to in terms of what we need for that sort of vaccine rollout mentality, we do need to think a bit more of a centralised view. And I say that not just in terms of government, I talk about together with the sector, and looking and saying, what is it we need to build out? Where is it going to be acceptable to build this out? How do we do the grid in an efficient way, also to minimise impacts on communities as well? And then have a better look at what the supply chain is. You know, and the Catapult does a great job at identifying. So look, this is where the opportunities are to increase potential here. So we work together. So, you know, it's going to be challenging, but we know what we need to do. You know, it's not we're scratching our heads anymore. We've just got to get on and do it, frankly.
Tom.
Yeah, just a final thing. I think I fully agree. I mean, let's recognise what this government has done. It's actually been really good in terms of the 2030 target, the 40 gigawatts, most ambitious any government's done. But also we are seeing on a lot of these issues like grid work streams going ahead or aviation issues happening. But I think the key point which would answer both Ben and what Pavel's saying is, look, Andrew said the 100 gigawatts. That's pretty much where most people are about how much is probably going to end up being, right? There's various ranges there, 80 to 120, but 100 is not a bad guess. And if you actually put that a lot more concrete out there for 2040 target, yeah, 2035, 2040 target, so go beyond the 2030, that addresses a lot of the stuff around what the supply chain needs. That allows us to do the strategic planning that the industry wants, which is start at the top level and say, well, we're going to do 80 or 100, whatever the number is. That allows you then to do a grid strategic plan, a marine spatial plan strategic plan, a skill plan, a supply chain plan, right? And it sounds a bit too central government, and you're probably surprised that commercial companies like SSC and RWE are here saying we need more strategic planning. What we're not asking for is to reduce competition. Yeah, on one hand, on some projects we're together and working together, on other ones we're fighting, to basically get our project ahead, and we don't want to get rid of that. But we've got to have the strategic plan to enable collaboration, because you need collaboration if you're going to get supply chain going. Because it's no good me saying to a manufacturer that I'm going to do one project, and then SSE say to a different manufacturer 2 years later they're going to go to a different one. We need us to give them the order book of all our projects going forward. So more strategic planning, and then I say grid. There's a lot of good initiatives. It is grid for me, and the way I think about it is, if broadband is the enabler of the digital age, then grid is the enabler of the low carbon age. And we need it not just for our offshore wind farms, we need it for the onshore wind farms, we need it for the EVs, we need it for the heat pumps. And so this strategic plan for the grid, and thinking about, actually it's an infrastructure thing we should over-invest in order that we can get there fast, rather than thinking about it from a perspective of let's minimise investment in order to kind of make sure we're not paying ever so slightly too much. And I think that's the wrong way forward. We need to say, like we did in broadband, we're just going to get everybody on broadband. We're just going to get everybody on a high quality grid.
Great, more questions. So this gentleman here and this lady here. So if we start with this gentleman here.
Thank you. I was really encouraged by, Tom, your optimism on renewables can do it. And I think you mentioned your 8,000 hours and your 800 hours. Maybe you could expand on that. It sounded to me like you think we'll overcome the intermittency problem. So two questions. Presumably your optimism involves nuclear. And secondly, is there some implicit assumption about breakthroughs on storage, which is behind your optimism?
Yeah, okay. So I'm optimistic that we'll find a way. Exactly what that way will be is still the open to debate. So I think there's so basically, if you look at it, for most of the year, when it's not windy for a very short period of time, and we can cover that with battery storage. Yeah, pretty much. So we can, or flexible EVs, flexible heat pumps, etc. So as you electrify more, we'll get more flexibility within the system at the local level, which will help us do that short term. The thing that isn't answered is, to be honest, a year like this year, where this has been the lowest wind year for about 10 years, and then you have a bit of a problem, right? And particularly if you have 2 weeks of very low wind, right? Because then actually we don't have a storage solution that's economic. And if you tried to build batteries to cover that 2 weeks, the kind of numbers that you're looking at, somebody quoted the other day 600 billion to cover those 2 weeks. So it's ridiculous. You're not going to do that with batteries at the moment with current technologies. What we are looking at, and Emma mentioned it, is hydrogen. Yeah, so you could put green or blue hydrogen through a gas-fired power station. Yeah, and that is, so Siemens, who is the technology provider there, can already tell us that they can give us a GT or gas turbine that we can put 100% hydrogen through. Then you've got an issue about how does the hydrogen economy do? Where does the hydrogen come from? Where does the economics come from? So it's not saying, but it's a technology solution. The other one is carbon capture and storage. Again, it's a process that's used throughout the world for different applications on the oil rigs. So basically, you could, for that part there, you could either put a carbon capture on the back of a power station, or you do blue hydrogen with carbon capture and storage and burn the blue hydrogen in a power station. So these are all doable technologies. They're technologies that are proven today. So they're engineeringly proven today. The question is, how do you roll it out? So it's the practical side of it. So if I've got, the one I always give is one of my power stations, Didcot in Oxfordshire. So it supports the west of London. It's nowhere near a CCUS site, and it's nowhere near a hydrogen pipeline or potential hub. So how am I going to decarbonise that? I don't have an answer yet, honestly. So I know there's a technology that is there, but exactly how I do Didcot, I don't know yet. On other ones, for example, our Staythorpe site or our Pembroke site, very close to clusters, so highly likely we're going to use hydrogen or CCUS. So I think, and again, you could argue that if we put a good grid in, going back to my grid point, I don't need Didcot to be there. I could locate my power stations at the clusters, but that would require even more investment in the grid. So my point is, technology, engineering-wise, all solutions exist. We don't need a breakthrough technology. We just need a strategic plan about how you roll it out. So all these different energy vectors, whether that be carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, or renewables, work together. And that's I suppose, the interesting and exciting part that I find, because I'm also the largest gas generator. I've got 7 gigawatts to work out how to decarbonise. Yeah, but we as a company have got a net zero target. We've joined the race to zero, so it's also my job and my colleagues' job to try and work out how the hell we do that. So
you're
not easy.
You're a green tech optimist if we get the economic geography right.
Yeah, actually, it's not. I don't need to be optimist in green tech because the technology exists. I'm an optimist that together, because everybody's committed to get to net zero, and the fact that there's no political party that is against it, that we will come up with a solution. It might take slightly longer than we're currently anticipating, and that's why we need the pressure on the politicians and the policies today.
Look, Tom is, I'm going to embarrass Tom because, I don't know why, that's apparently what I'm doing this afternoon, but this is a panel that's made up of the traditional energy sector. Everyone around this table, Ben and myself accepted, these are industries that are decarbonising. This is not a kind of green piece of the energy industry that's advocating for something the energy sector as a whole doesn't believe in. I'm a decarbonisation specialist, and the industry appointed me as the chief executive of their trade body, and there is a reason for that. It's not altruism, it's not greenwashing, it's not because we want to signal that climate change is a nice thing to do, it's because the economic force is now with these technologies, and the kind of route to get there on the engineering and the physics is, whilst not straightforward, pretty clear. The answer to your question is the Prime Minister wants to decarbonise the power sector in the 2030s, specifically 2035. We think as an industry we have the technology capability to do that. Our hesitation comes from the lack of policy mechanisms to get us there. So can we scale these technologies up? Is there a strategic plan? Are we going to do the moonshot approach to doing this? This is not an industry that is frightened by that. Our argument to government is we cannot do it without the markets and the regulatory change that we're asking for. But if you do that, yeah.
Ben.
So, to give a specific context of this, it is happening in Teeside, which is why I think I'll probably be invited to the panel, because you've got the offshore wind in Dogger Bank, you've got the manufacture that's starting to happen, and hopefully we can attract more. But we also have an organisation called Net Zero Teeside, which is a consortium of all the big traditional oil and gas players, led by BP as the project lead, who, BP is an interesting example. 10 years ago, if anybody had ever said that BP were committing publicly to decarbonise by 2030, you'd have thought the world had ended and you were going mad. But Bernard, who's the chief exec at BP, is hugely passionate about that exactly, and they see their transition as Tom's just said, that they see that as seeing the world's first industrial scale carbon capture and storage facility happening on Teeside, which the economics can make sense, assuming that we're successful in the CCUS auction competition later this month. We need a bit more certainty about the financial mechanism of recompense in effect for carbon capture. That seems to be the one thing that's holding everything up. But they're so confident that we will get there. You speak to Andy Lane, who's the project lead for BP, who's running it on behalf of the consortium. If we're successful in the competition later this month, I think it is, maybe first or second week of November, they're going to put in more than £200 million to their FEED study. It's a multi-billion-pound project, and the way that they're helping stack up the finances is they're not just building a carbon capture facility. They've got different scales that they've got in their business plan, but their minimal business plan is a 1 gigawatt gas-fired power station that it helps underline the economics for their CCUS plant, but then is connecting into the wider grid. Now, again, I know this is a wind conversation, but then you get into some really interesting stuff about what you do with hydrogen. And, you've got to create a financial mechanism to recompense people for capturing carbon. When we're speaking to NZT and we're speaking to BEIS, and I don't know about you, Emma, but we've just refused to have the conversation with BEIS officials because it'll just blow their heads off about how you recompense negative carbon, because we've got potentially something called MGT, which is a biomass plant, which is arguably carbon neutral. If you plug a carbon neutral plant into CCUS, so it's negative carbon, how do you recompense that? We've just thought, let's not talk about that. Let's just get this over the line first, or it seems to be the way that it is. But if you can get carbon capture to stack up, and that, even after the competition isn't enough, because the financial mechanism still won't be published, I don't think, until probably early next year to be able to recompense, which is plenty of time because it's going to take a couple of years to build this facility. You then have this balance again. There's lots of interesting stuff about how you could use the North Sea caverns with compressed gas as a storage space as well into hydrogen. It's really exciting for Teeside. Teeside already produces more than 50% of all of the hydrogen produced in the UK because of the chemical and processing cluster that we have. So we see the announcement. It didn't really get picked up widely, but it was a very significant announcement actually for the UK as well as Teeside, that BP and ADNOC have come out and committed to, in effect, invest £1 billion into hydrogen technology in Teeside but it's all really predicated if we're successful in the competition for CCUS, because it's a bit like the electric car issue as well, that if you're going to get into hydrogen, which can help balance the ecosystem in the economy, it's pointless just producing hydrogen through steam methane reformers. You've got to be able to produce it in a green way, and then you ultimately get to an issue that actually you're turning energy into hydrogen to then use as an energy source doesn't seem like an efficient way. So I know we're probably speaking to the wrong people in this room who already know this, but that's where wind can then come back in and play a really interesting part, especially if you're getting to the low level of cost per megawatt hour of energy that can be produced when people aren't, awake in bed, not turning the kettle on. You can really start to balance out the economy, but that's where it all sits. So I think wind's doing pretty well. We can go further and faster. CCUS, government need to get on and publish the financial mechanism for recompense for carbon, in effect, and capturing the carbon. How do you recompense the industries that are all plugging into that carbon capture facility? And then ultimately the issue with hydrogen is there isn't the economy of scale to make hydrogen come down in cost. Now, I'm a big believer, and again, this might be an interesting one to go off on a tangent, Ryan, I apologise for hijacking the panel, but I'm a huge believer that hydrogen should be playing the role in decarbonising the gas system. And I think if the government were clever in a little bit like what they're doing in offshore wind, in having a switchover date, say we're going to go completely 100% hydrogen in the gas network by 2035, 2040, the one issue you've got with hydrogen is there's no certainty for the private sector to be able to see the switchover and then build up that capacity. It would create a base load as well. The technology is more advanced in hydrogen than people think. The issue that is going on in government at the minute is they don't currently believe that you can use the existing gas network with 100% hydrogen, which we're confident, I think, of being able to disprove with the likes of BP and NGN, where we're currently testing this as we speak. So again, absolutely we want to go back to talking about wind, but you soon go down the rabbit hole of those are just two technologies. There's all sorts of other things that go into the mix as well, and you can see how, Kwasi gets it, Kwasi Kwarteng gets it as Secretary of State. He's a big believer in hydrogen and offshore wind and CCUS, but the whole system within government has to change, and it's great that we've got a Secretary of State in Bays that gets this now. It's great that the Prime Minister buys into things like offshore wind and also hydrogen and CCUS, but you find that some of the civil service and the departments aren't all on the same page, and DFT is a great example. They're just not on the same page as Bays, and that causes problems when you're trying to introduce new technologies to try and test some of this stuff to create a scale that works.
Right. So can I just just to add, this is how passionate all my team get as well when they start talking about projects, right? Yeah. Because you do simple things like our wire goes into the Wilton site in Teeside, right? And straight away the CEO of Semcop calls up and goes, well, can you sell me some green power, Tom, from my industrial site in Teeside, because they all want a green. And then we go, why do you want a green? Well, we want to produce some hydrogen. And then we're like, well, if you want, we'll put electrolyzer on there if you want, and we'll help you do that. But the economics of the electrolyzer only makes sense if you've got a hydrogen economy, right? But if you've also got some blue hydrogen in there, it gives you enough investment to start building a hydrogen economy, which you can feed blue and green into, etc. And I think, for me, it's the energy vector part, right? So everything gets interrelated in this if you want to decarbonise, and that's why I don't just talk about wind. I also talk about how we're going to decarbonise everything, because that's what you need to get to.
Shall we segue back? Hang on, I reckon I can segue us back to wind.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Anna.
So firstly, the nice thing to say to any of you that aren't in the energy industry, and you should be, it's clearly the most exciting bit of the economy, is that this is what happens to you when you start working in energy right now, because it is genuinely a really fascinating time, and fundamentally,
I don't even work in energy.
I know.
I'm thinking about giving you a job.
Honestly, the learning curve that I've gone through over 4 years. My wife is very supportive but not interested in politics, and she's been to a couple of events, and all I'm doing is net zero stuff. And she's heard it once, and she's just like, I don't understand why you find any of this really interesting, and how you know so.
I'm like the most boring in my life.
The energy sector drags you in, it gets you caught into it, and it pulls you in, and you find yourself getting really excited
they're going to dress you as a wind turbine
exactly,
at some point, Ben.
I think I'm going to be dressed as a hydrogen molecule.
So on the hydrogen wind thing, look, I think one of the most interesting things about the whole system is as follows. Firstly, so the reason that there's disagreement between someone like you, Ben, in your job, and a civil servant in Bays is the challenge of decarbonisation, and actually just generally the economics of the energy sector is that it's clearly pointing towards a world where we want to use very cheap electrons as efficiently as possible through the system. So that's the first thing. And when you look at a system-wide decarbonisation pathway, the issue for hydrogen is not actually in the end use case and how great it would be if we could repurpose the gas network. It's in the production volume we think we can get upstream and just how valuable it's going to be for other bits of the economy that are hard to decarbonise. So you're going to want hydrogen for industrial applications in clusters, and I suspect that because of how much we're going to be using wind turbines to just power the rest of the economy, it'll be very, very difficult to make completely net zero compatible hydrogen at the sort of scale we need to then do everything else. So it's valuable enough that you're going to want it for the special things. And that's why, Bayes' job, and in fact I'd agree with you, Whitehall's job is to make some of those really tough, whole economy strategic decisions. However, the other thing that I think on things like heat decarbonisation is where you have industrial clusters, it's Tom's point about place too, about gas-fired power stations, we're going to want to make choices in regions that reflect the kind of geographic potential of those regions, both in terms of the industry they've got and the natural resources. So all of the offshore wind fleet is going to be where we've got the best wind resource, right? All of the hydrogen is going to be where we've probably got an existing industrial cluster or an offshore wind fleet. And so for end customers, I think it's entirely possible that you'll have things like heat networks that run off hydrogen in a place like Teeside where you're going to be producing a lot of it. So I think what government has to grapple with, on top of everything else they have to grapple with, is how do you do the whole system at national level, but then how do you also plan things out in regions, and for heat that'll be particularly important.
So this is going to demonstrate now my ceiling now and my level of naivety, but if you have a gas network, we do it with natural gas, we produce natural gas, we import it from the North Sea, etc. Why can't you have a similar system? I appreciate you've got to get up to the volumes, and especially blue hydrogen being a transition into green hydrogen, because we all know it's a transition really into green. But if you're, say, 20 years away, so you have a 2040, even make it 2050, you've got a 30-year horizon, there's got to be the belief in the innovation in the industry to be able to build the hydrogen production end that allows for the capacity to be able to decarbonise much larger parts of the economy, rather than just the niche bits.
We've done it before, haven't we? We didn't always have natural gas. We had coal gas or town gas,
which was 50% hydrogen.
To things. So I just want to answer the gentleman's point. I'm a big fan of hydrogen. There's something beautifully intuitive or attractive that you burn hydrogen, you make water. That's the byproduct, water. Let's get on with it. And it is an answer to the storage world. In terms of the balancing the intermittency that does naturally obviously exist with other forms of renewables, particularly wind power. I just wanted to point out as well, we're always talking about hydrogen in the UK. Look across the water at other countries, particularly Germany. They're doing multi-million euro projects on the application of hydrogen, particularly into heating and serving towns and cities. They will have to import hydrogen from wherever. They don't have an oil and gas industry to rely on and to convert. We do. So my call is, let's get the strategic rationale around where we want to be within hydrogen, and let's make the best use of what we've got in all our skill sets, and indeed the production of other products that can be converted into this, including wind. Because if we sit back and pontificate for too long, we know what's going to happen. Other players are going to capture the economic opportunity of hydrolyzers or making pipes or whatever it is, and we buy it all in to try, and it makes it even harder for us to think and contemplate making such a big infrastructure change for the future. We've got, as well as for net zero, it's not just electricity, it's heat and transport. We've got to think about that heat point, because it's always the poor, Emma, it's always the poor cousin at a policy level, because it's so difficult. We've got buildings to fix, and pipes to lay, and roads to dig up and all that. You can just put up a wind farm, pop in a cable, and you answer some of the electricity.
It's also the politics of it as well.
It is.
So you have the cost of the consumer,
we
the policies, we don't want to increase the energy bills. There's a lot of that difficult conversation that heating in the home, all of a sudden goes into that too hard box because of policy decisions.
I'm just going to bring in.
Ryan's like, oh my God, what
I'm being sucked into it.
We're going to. We can tell.
Yeah, exactly. I know, I'm learning a lot. Let's bring in more questions. So just here.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Foster and I'm from Bright Blue and I'm passionate about renewable energy. So just in September there was a 724 kilometre subsea cable installed powering homes in the UK from Norway. What's your vision for international transmission for the UK? Thank you.
Great, good question. Any more questions? I've got one from the live stream. This is the last round of questions. Great. So I have a question from Duncan Sinclair, who asks, it's been mentioned that there isn't enough capacity near shore to produce the energy we need, but what about the role of onshore wind? How much of a role does that have? So, 2 questions there, and I'm going to ask each of the panellists to cover them. So, Pavel, I'll ask you to go first, if that's all right.
So cover both the questions.
Well, it's up to you.
I'll cover both. I'll try and be quick. So on the first one, sort of the interconnect, I think you're talking about the new one, the new one with Norway, which is amazing feat of engineering, having sort of an HVDC cable that long, incredible. Tapping into a Norwegian hydro is great for our energy security. There's more we can do, I think, particularly to countries like Norway. I know you talk about Iceland, maybe that's a bit too far. But that maybe have a slightly different energy demand and generation profile from what we have, I think will help. I think we should acknowledge the limits, though, of relying on sort of importing energy through interconnectors. I'm all for it. I think it will help us integrate our wind system. But I think, particularly in Northern Europe, weather conditions will be quite similar. If you look at a lot of other countries also going strong on wind, so we just need to recognise the limitations from an energy security perspective, but no doubt positive thing. And then Duncan's question on onshore wind, I mean, absolutely, yes. I know it's, onshore wind sort of got relegated in the discussion tonight, but I think that's more representative more generally, because it doesn't have probably the scale potential that offshore wind does and hasn't generated the same economic benefits in recent years, but it definitely has an important part to play, because frankly we need everything, as we've just talked about there. We need all the different complementary technologies, and actually what we're seeing on onshore wind, for example, is increased public support. I think Tom, you alluded to that earlier. We see that in areas where we built projects, which admittedly predominantly is in Scotland, huge support for that. So then when we're looking at potential extension of some of those projects, we've actually got a community who already have got it there and understand it and support it. So that's obviously really, really important. So yeah, probably if I was
Thank you.
chip in.
Tom.
Right, so interconnectors is a complicated topic. I mean, I think in principle, the more interconnected and meshed you are, the better, right, as Pavel said. That's like a nice principle, security supply, cheaper cost, etc., etc. I think there's a few things you just need to be aware of with interconnectors. I think number one is they go both ways. So they don't necessarily increase security of supply. You can be exporting when you've got low wind, and as Pavel said, there's a great correlation of wind across Northwest Europe. And I think there's also a risk of exporting your emissions. So at the moment we've got a mismatch. The carbon tax and total carbon price in the UK is much higher than in Europe. So I can tell you I used to be in an old job in charge of commercial for the whole of Europe. And there was times when I was turning off gas stations in the UK and turning on coal stations in Germany, because of the differential in carbon price, and then we imported it over the interconnector. So you've got to be really careful that if you're going to do that you have fair carbon pricing across, you're not just exporting emissions. And I think also there's a big opportunity with this meshed interconnectors, so not just thinking about interconnectors, but thinking about multi-purpose interconnectors, which we're talking about now as part of the offshore transmission network review about, how can you put more offshore in? And there's a great opportunity. If we can export more, we can build even more. I mean, we've got the sea. The UK has a third of all Europe's wind. Brilliant. Let's just keep on going, and we can make it an export job as well, as long as it's fair. On onshore, yeah, it's a key part. I mean, you can still grow. It was great as part of the latest AR4, the latest auction rounds, that we're going to have up to 5 gigawatts of onshore wind and solar. Very important. It does have more local planning issues, so we need this honest conversation again around, in the communities that host them, making sure they get good community benefits, making sure that there is a positive planning framework for doing onshore. But we see that, 30 gigawatts of onshore maybe by 2030, 2040, so a real important part of the energy mix.
Thank you. Andrew.
I don't think I've got too much to add to that. I think I've always been a fan of, we are an island nation surrounded by water, let's make maximum use of the resources that are there. It is good, obviously, for security of supply to have interconnectors to other countries, but let's not overly rely on that, because it's a bit like, the gas reliance we've got ultimately from Russia. That, so you've got to take those things into account. But if we have natural resources here, we should, maximise them. But I think anyone who's in the electricity industry knows we need a balanced system. It's not one of everything, and therefore we should have different blends of renewables and clean energy. And likewise for the grid security, we should have tap-in points to other places so that we can make, as Tom's explained, we can maximise our sales opportunities as well as imports. But my caution is just not to go down the route of, they make it cheaper than us, let's just build a line and we'll just buy it in for them forever. That's not a long-term strategy in anyone's business.
And just to chip in on that, I've just had a further thought, actually. So there's I won't go into too much detail, but there's a policy support mechanism available for interconnectors, which is great. We don't have that yet, for example, for large-scale storage.
Yeah.
Is that, to me, that's a missing policy piece of the jigsaw. As I said earlier, I think long-duration storage is really important. At the moment, there isn't really a policy market framework to incentivise that. So that seems odd, where we're doing it maybe for interconnectors, but not for storage, which is within Britain.
Good point.
Emma.
About the politics has definitely moved on somewhat, because I don't think I've said Brexit once at this conference, but why not now? So I'll add something to what the others have said, Richard. So firstly, the kind of energy system that we know to be cheapest is one that maximises the wind fleet and the use of electrons through the system. That's about flexibility within the system, but we do know that we need some interconnection, so we know that we need it. I agree with what some others have said about the market design there. The other thing I'm really excited about with interconnectors is like meshed grids. So we haven't talked about it, but North Sea cooperation, we've talked about it in abstract, but essentially we think we probably need some new institutional and governance mechanisms, because we're going to be talking about multiple countries with a kind of shared grid out at sea. And that's what's interesting about mesh grids out in the North Sea, is that also there are some brilliant mad ideas coming forward about things like being able to manufacture hydrogen out at sea, because it may be more efficient than kind of doing it back here. So things like a hydrogen island out in the North Sea. All of this is the kind of infrastructure planning that we, again, need to think through, but is also multi-jurisdictional. Which brings me to Brexit. On the interconnectors, as Tom alluded to, what makes them efficient is when you've got shared pricing and shared markets. And at the moment we have, or had, an aligned carbon market with Europe in the ETS. We've now got our own carbon market in the UK. We also had aligned energy markets. We're supposed to have the next phase of the trade and withdrawal agreement implemented this autumn, which kind of replicates some of that cooperation across those markets. It's really important we get that, because we're interconnected and we're going to be increasingly so. We're a bit worried that's being delayed. So I think on your point, we think we need more cooperation, not less. We probably need the institutions that can do that. And just on the sheer economics, that's better for customers in the long run, we think, but only as long as the kind of markets, the carbon prices and everything else stack up. So you can't just do the infrastructure and hope for the best. You have to go one step further. And I actually, on top of everything else I'm worried about this autumn, I'm slightly worried about some of the noises I'm hearing about that process being slower than we'd like it to be.
Okay, and then final thoughts from Ben.
The interconnector stuff's quite interesting, and the Brexit point is well made, actually, because there is some politics happening in mainland Europe as well. There's delayed, I think, to Offshore, because there's supposed to be rounds of interconnectors that Offshore run that have been delayed and are causing some concern. Yeah. Offshore are actually relatively supportive of interconnector as a UK policy, but there's been, I know of a couple of projects that are being stalled at the other end, not necessarily even by the French, dare I say it, have actually been quite supportive of it as well. But actually, there's a lot of politics in the European Union as we transition and try and get these cooperation agreements that are causing problems. I mean, I am an absolute energy convert. There are some I like more than others. I don't really want to end this on a negative, but I feel like I'm going to have to. But onshore wind is to the industry on the panel, is going to be more of a problem than I think people recognise. It's one of the reasons that offshore wind has been so successful, is because in reality the politics of it are that it takes it away from the community. So all of those local planning issues, local council issues, MP issues that everybody's kind of half alluding to, but are really the issues for onshore wind. You know, you will have people very supportive saying, let's get to net zero, and then as soon as you decide to build an onshore wind farm in their constituency, all hell will break loose. There'll be JRs, there'll be local petitions, the MP will be standing on his or her front page of the local newspaper and say, this is disgusting, we shouldn't be doing these types of things. So I would just, again, and I personally think that actually with the success of offshore wind, I think onshore wind might be a bit of a black mark on the industry's view, because I actually think that in certain communities as well, people would rather have so in Teeside, I would say people would rather say, I don't want onshore wind at all. They love the idea of offshore wind, happy to take all these jobs. We'd rather have a conversation about AMRs or SMRs in nuclear, because they think it's, you know, more tidy, takes up less space, can go in more of an industrial space. I mean, it's all of the preconceived notions that people will have. So I think let's not get away from the fact that onshore wind is going to be much more difficult to deliver than I think what we've actually managed to achieve in offshore wind, full stop.
I think
we're going to end there.
No, let Emma respond.
Just-
Let Emma respond. I want an answer to this question.
Yeah, go on then.
I
People are a bit
reckon-
too optimistic.
It's
about
got to be a
offshore
minute,
wind.
though.
So, in a minute, I think that was right based on how we deployed onshore wind previously, but two things. Firstly, we've got 5.8 gigawatts in the pipeline already through planning, ready to go. So that's where the public has been brought through. Secondly, where the wind resources is not actually where we've had significant public resistance previously. Now, that isn't to say you don't get that reaction that we talked about at the beginning, but I think it's not necessarily the political problem that we've had previously, because the sites are in different places, and particularly for the Conservatives, where that has been a strong issue, the sites and the seats don't necessarily match. And the last thing I'd say is I'm going to back both industry and the public. I think we might find that the moon music has shifted significantly. And if you see the debate on the Cumbrian coal mine, for example, I think people understand local decisions now in a much bigger context for climate change. And I don't know how many of the panel have got kids as well, but like increasingly that generation is putting pressure on their parents and politicians to do some action. And I'm going to really watch what happens with this next CFD round and those projects getting built. But I am willing to bet that they go better than the previous iteration of this, and I think we all might be pleasantly surprised.
Okay.
No, I'll be right.
Well, just at the end, just at the end there, where there was harmony, we brought a little bit of discord. So thank you everyone for joining us and joining Bright Blue for the whole of the party conference. If you were at other events, we're very grateful for you participating. Just to say that you've got some goodie bags on your chairs. Please take those away with you. It's got some magazines in. And we've got a special offer, which is if you want to become a member of Bright Blue and support our work, help us defend and improve liberal society and come up with lots of new interesting policy ideas around energy and environment, then please do join us. A special offer of £10. Speak to Joe at the back there with his blue jumper on, sporting the team colours. And can I say a big thank you to all of the speakers and also to RWE and SSE Renewables for partnering with us on the event. But if we could give a round of applause to the speakers, that would be great.